Step away from the vehicle and put your hands on the roof.
I'm a U.S. citizen and a nurse. Why do you need my ID?
We're conducting an immigration check. Step back now.
The neon sign of the Chevron station buzzed with a low, erratic hum, casting long, flickering shadows across the cracked concrete. It was 3:15 in the morning in a desolate stretch of West Texas, the kind of quiet that feels less peaceful and more like a held breath. Maya leaned her head against the steering wheel of her 10-year-old Honda Civic, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. She was 28, a registered nurse who had just finished her fourth consecutive 12-hour shift in the ER of a regional hospital near the border. Her scrubs still carried the faint, sterile scent of antiseptic and the heavy memory of a chaotic trauma ward. All she wanted was a black coffee, a tank of gas, and the dark silence of her apartment. She didn't know that in less than 10 minutes, her life would be violently derailed by a catastrophic failure of procedure, a chain reaction of unchecked assumptions, and a blatant disregard for the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. She pushed the car door open, the desert night air immediately biting through her thin cotton scrubs. The convenience store was empty save for the clerk dozing behind the register and a solitary man in a dark green tactical uniform pouring coffee near the back wall. Maya didn't pay him much attention. Living and working in a border region meant seeing Customs and Border Protection or Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents everywhere, at grocery stores, at diners, at gas stations in the dead of night. She grabbed a cup, filled it with the darkest roast available, and stood in line. The agent, a man whose name tag read Miller, walked past her to the counter. He didn't just look at her, he assessed her. His eyes swept over her faded scrubs, her exhausted posture, the dark circles under her eyes, and her complexion. It was a look Maya had felt before, a heavy, unearned scrutiny, but she was too tired to care. She paid for her coffee and walked out to the pump. As she squeezed the fuel nozzle, the heavy crunch of tactical boots on gravel broke the silence. Agent Miller had followed her outside and was standing entirely too close to the rear bumper of her Civic, a flashlight suddenly illuminating her license plate. The harsh beam reflected off the metal, blindingly bright in the dim lot. Maya's heart executed a slow, uncomfortable thud. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but the presence of law enforcement demanding sudden attention always carried an inherent weight. Miller walked slowly to her side of the car, his hand resting casually, yet purposefully, on his utility belt. He didn't lead with a greeting. He didn't ask how her night was going. Instead, his voice cut through the cold air with the flat, practiced authority of someone who expects immediate compliance. He asked her what she was doing out so late. Maya blinked, the exhaustion suddenly competing with a rising spike of adrenaline. She kept her voice steady, aiming for polite neutrality, and explained she was just getting off a shift at the county hospital and was heading home. It was a simple, truthful answer, one that should have concluded the interaction. But Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. He shone the flashlight into the back seat of her car, illuminating empty fast food bags and a discarded nursing textbook. In the eyes of the law, an officer needs articulable, reasonable suspicion to detain someone. This means they must have specific, objective facts that indicate a person is involved in criminal activity. A hunch, a gut feeling, or a bias based on someone's appearance or the time of night does not meet the legal threshold established by the Supreme Court. Yet, Miller was already operating outside those constitutional boundaries. He had no reports of a crime in the area. He had no traffic violation to cite, as Maya wasn't even driving. He had only his own internal assumptions, a black woman in a battered car near a border corridor at 3 a.m. looking nervous. And in his mind, that flawed arithmetic equaled suspicion. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, and demanded to see her identification and her papers. The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Papers. Not a driver's license for a traffic stop, but a demand for proof of citizenship. Maya froze. She was a natural-born citizen, born and raised in Houston, Texas. Her family had lived in the state for 4 generations. The sheer absurdity of the request fought with the very real danger of the situation. She asked him why he needed her identification, a fundamental right of any citizen when stopped by law enforcement without cause. Her voice trembled slightly, not from guilt, but from the terrifying realization that this man had power over her and was not playing by the rules. Miller's demeanor shifted instantly from probing to aggressive. He interpreted her question not as a lawful invocation of her rights, but as defiance. He told her that he was conducting an immigration check and that she fit the profile of someone moving undocumented individuals. It was a staggering leap of logic, completely devoid of probable cause. Maya reached slowly into her pocket to pull out her hospital badge, hoping the laminated ID would de-escalate the situation. She told him her wallet was in her purse on the passenger seat, but held up the badge, the word RN printed boldly next to her tired face. Miller barely glanced at it. Instead, he took a step back and placed his hand firmly on his holster, barking a command for her to step away from the vehicle and place her hands on the roof. The procedural errors were compounding at a terrifying rate. What started as an already legally dubious consensual encounter had rapidly morphed into an unlawful detention. Without probable cause, a reasonable belief that a crime has been, is being, or will be committed, an officer cannot search you or your vehicle. But the reality of the street often moves faster than the slow wheels of constitutional law. When a man with a badge and a gun tells you to put your hands on a car, you do it, knowing that arguing the Fourth Amendment on the side of a highway is a gamble you might not survive. Maya placed her hands on the cold metal roof of her Civic. The rough concrete bit into her knees as Miller suddenly kicked her legs apart. She gasped, the sheer indignity and shock of the physical contact causing hot tears to prick her eyes. She wasn't resisting, she was terrified. He patted her down with a rough, impersonal efficiency, finding nothing but lint and chapstick. Then, without asking for consent, without a warrant, and without any valid exception to the warrant requirement, he opened her car door. He began tearing through her purse, dumping its contents onto the passenger seat. Her driver's license, her credit cards, her apartment keys, and a framed photo of her mother spilled out. He was looking for something, anything, to retroactively justify the illegal stop. He was searching for a crime to fit his suspicion, rather than investigating a suspicion based on a crime. While he ransacked her belongings, Maya stood frozen against the car, the cold seeping into her bones. A few cars drove by on the distant highway, their headlights sweeping indifferently over the scene. She felt entirely alone, swallowed by a system that was supposed to protect her but was currently violating her most basic rights. Miller emerged from the car, holding her Texas driver's license. He looked at it, looked at her, and scoffed. He muttered something about how easy it was to fake state IDs these days. It was a chilling moment of confirmation bias. Presented with concrete evidence that contradicted his initial assumption, his mind simply invented a new narrative to sustain his bias. He told her she was being detained until her identity and citizenship could be verified by the database at the local sector station. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound Maya had ever heard. The cold steel locked around her wrists, biting into her skin as he wrenched her arms behind her back. She was not read her Miranda rights, because in Miller's mind, he wasn't making a formal arrest. He was executing a brief investigative hold. But the law sees it differently. When you are handcuffed, placed in the back of a law enforcement vehicle, and transported to a secure facility, you are under arrest. And an arrest without probable cause is a blatant violation of civil rights. Maya sat in the rigid plastic back seat of the ICE cruiser, her tears finally spilling over. She was a nurse who spent her days saving lives, now treated like a hardened criminal because of a toxic cocktail of geography, appearance, and a federal agent's unchecked authority. The holding facility was a sterile, brightly lit nightmare of cinder block and stainless steel. Maya was placed in a small, windowless room. The air smelled of bleach and old sweat. Her handcuffs were removed, but the door locked heavily behind her. She sat on a metal bench, staring at the blank wall, time losing all meaning. Hours bled into one another. She worried about her cat at home. She worried about missing her next shift, but mostly she worried that she would somehow disappear into this bureaucratic black hole. The psychological toll of unlawful detention is immediate and severe. It strips away your fundamental sense of autonomy and replaces it with a deep, paralyzing helplessness. Outside her cell, the gears of reality were finally beginning to grind against Agent Miller's assumptions. A supervisor arrived for the morning shift and began reviewing the overnight detentions. When he pulled Maya's file, he found a glaring lack of paperwork. There was no incident report justifying the stop, no articulate suspicion logged, just a name and a set of fingerprints waiting to be run through the system. The supervisor ran her information. It took less than 2 minutes for the screen to populate. Maya was exactly who she said she was. No criminal record, no immigration violations, a valid nursing license, and a registered vehicle. The supervisor's blood ran cold, recognizing immediately the massive liability sitting in cell number 4. The door finally opened. It wasn't Agent Miller who walked in, but the supervisor, looking tense and deeply uncomfortable. He didn't apologize. In law enforcement and legal battles, an apology can be construed as an admission of guilt. Instead, he used the passive, detached language of bureaucracy. He told her there had been a misunderstanding regarding her identity and that she was free to go. He handed her belongings back in a clear plastic bag. Maya stood up, her body stiff and aching. She didn't yell. She didn't demand to see Miller. She was running purely on survival instinct, desperate to get out of the building. She walked out into the blinding mid-morning sun, the heat of the Texas day already pressing down. Her car had been impounded and towed back to the gas station. She had to pay a $40 cab fare just to get back to her vehicle. When she finally unlocked her apartment door, she collapsed onto her hallway floor and wept until she physically couldn't anymore. The story could have ended there. For thousands of people who experience similar undocumented violations of their rights, it does. The exhaustion of daily life, the fear of retaliation, and the sheer cost of legal representation often silence victims of procedural overreach. But as Maya recovered from the trauma over the following weeks, the helplessness she felt in that holding cell hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. She realized that if Agent Miller could do this to an educated, English-speaking citizen with a stable career, what was he doing to those who had less power, less voice, and less understanding of their rights? She began making phone calls. Finding a lawyer willing to sue a federal agency is difficult. Suing individual federal agents is even harder, due to a legal doctrine known as qualified immunity, which shields government officials from liability unless they violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights. Furthermore, actions against federal agents often fall under a specific legal framework known as a Bivens action, named after a landmark Supreme Court case, which allows individuals to sue federal officers for damages for constitutional violations. Maya met with civil rights attorneys across the state until she found a team who saw the case not just as a civil rights violation, but as a textbook, irrefutable failure of Fourth Amendment procedure. The lawsuit was filed in federal court. It wasn't a quick process. The legal battle stretched over 3 agonizing years. The defense team for the government tried every tactic in the book to dismiss the case. They argued that Miller was acting in good faith, that the geographic area justified heightened suspicion, and that the stop was brief and investigative. But Maya's lawyers were relentless. During the discovery phase, they deposed Agent Miller. Under oath, stripped of his uniform and his authority, his justifications crumbled. When asked to articulate the specific, objective reasons he had to suspect Maya of a crime, he could only offer vague statements about her demeanor and the location. He was forced to admit he had no warrant, no consent, and no probable cause to search her vehicle. Even more damning, the legal team subpoenaed Miller's disciplinary records and dashcam footage from previous stops. They uncovered a pattern. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a habitual practice. Miller had a documented history of conducting Terry stops, brief detentions for questioning, that routinely extended far beyond their lawful scope, almost exclusively targeting minorities. He frequently used the guise of immigration checks to bypass the requirement for probable cause, effectively utilizing his federal badge as a master key to violate civil liberties. The procedural error in Maya's case wasn't just a mistake. It was a feature of his policing style, a willful ignorance of the law he was sworn to uphold. As the evidence mounted, the government's position became untenable. The blatant lack of reasonable suspicion for the initial demand for papers, the illegal search of the vehicle, and the subsequent unlawful arrest created a perfect storm of liability. The shield of qualified immunity cracked under the weight of such clearly established violations. A judge denied the government's motion to dismiss, ruling that any reasonable officer would have known that detaining a citizen and searching their car under these specific circumstances was unconstitutional. Facing a public trial that would expose systemic failures and a potentially massive jury verdict, the government opted to settle. The settlement was finalized at $11.7 million. It was a staggering number, one of the largest of its kind for a wrongful detention case that did not involve severe physical injury or death. But the legal team had successfully argued the profound psychological damage inflicted, the loss of liberty, and the necessity of a punitive figure to deter future unconstitutional behavior by the agency. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the department and the broader law enforcement community. It wasn't just a payout, it was a loud, financially devastating warning that the Constitution does not have a geographic loophole, and that implicit bias cannot be used as a substitute for probable cause. For Maya, the money changed her life, but it didn't erase the memory. She bought a house, paid off her student loans, and eventually stepped away from bedside nursing to start a consultancy firm educating marginalized communities about their legal rights during police encounters. She still flinches when she sees a patrol car in her rearview mirror. The trauma of having your freedom arbitrarily stripped away leaves a permanent scar. The justice she received was financial, but true justice would have been the encounter never happening in the first place. The $11.7 million settlement forces us to look past the surface of the headlines. It wasn't awarded simply because a bad officer was mean to an innocent nurse. It was awarded because the fundamental rules of American freedom, the strict, uncompromising procedures designed to protect citizens from government overreach, were completely ignored. When law enforcement operates on assumption rather than evidence, the entire system of justice begins to rot from the inside out. It leaves us to wonder, how many unrecorded encounters happen every night on quiet, dark highways where the victim doesn't have the resources to fight back? If the price of a single unchecked assumption is $11.7 million and a shattered sense of security, the true lesson here is that our constitutional rights are only as strong as the systems that hold those in power accountable for breaking them.